Evening. Welcome to the Graduate School of Education and Psychology Distinguished Lecture Series, named after our Dean Emeritus, Margaret J. Weber. My name is Vanessa John. I'm the Director of Culture and Community here at GSEP. It's my honor to welcome you, and a special welcome to those of you that are joining us on Zoom. This is a reminder, if you would keep your microphones muted to help us cut down on background noise. This evening's session is also being recorded, so you will be able to play this back via our website. You'll find that on our DLS webpage as well as our YouTube channel. And before we open in prayer, I would like to welcome a few special guests with us this evening. The first is the Dean of our Graduate School of Education and Psychology, Dr. Farzeen Majidi. And our Associate Dean of Psychology, Dr. Robert DeMayo. And a special welcome to all of our alumni joining us this evening, and those of you that are on Zoom, welcome home. I would now like to welcome the Director of GSEP's Alumni Relations, Dr. Renee Dorn, to open our session in prayer. Dr. Dorn.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And once again, welcome to all of the GSEP alumni. It's always exciting when alumni are able to join us. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together once again. In Los Angeles, it's a little rainy, but even though it's a little rainy, we're still thank you for the blessing of having this rain so that things can grow. And while we're here learning more and more about what we're going to hear tonight, we're going to grow a little bit more. So we thank you for everything that you have given us and everything that you plan on giving us tonight and in the future. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. DeMayo so that he can make his introductions.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I am honored to welcome Dr. Lisa Miller to Pepperdine for our GSEP Distinguished Lecture Series. Dr. Miller is a professor in the clinical psychology program at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she founded the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute, the first Ivy League graduate program and research institute in spirituality and psychology. A graduate of Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Miller earned her doctorate under the founder of positive psychology, Dr. Martin Seligman. Dr. Miller is the New York Times best-selling author of The Spiritual Child and her new book, The Awakened Brain. Dr. Miller's co-presenter tonight is Dr. Edward Shafranske, a fellow of the American Psychological Association and professor of psychology and director of our Doctor of Psychology program here at the Pepperdine Graduate School of Education and Psychology. He has served as editor of APA's first text on religion and the Clinical Practice of Psychology, associate editor of the APA Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality, and co-editor of Spiritually Oriented Psychotherapy. His publications have focused on the relationships between religion, spirituality, and mental health, and the applied psychology of religion. Drs. Miller and Shafranske have each served 2 terms as president of the APA Society for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. The insights and research Drs. Miller and Shafranske will elaborate on tonight will point to a human experience beyond the material and how we can build on those experiences as they relate to mental health and education. Following their presentation, we'll hear from Pepperdine faculty members and one of our doctoral students who will engage with the presenters regarding the integration of religion and spirituality in their professional practices as educators and clinicians. So with that, please join me in welcoming our presenters. Shafranske.
Well, thank you, Dr. DeMayo and everyone. It's a real pleasure for us to be here with you tonight. You know, there was a saying a number of years ago about how religion and spirituality were forgotten in the field of psychology. I'm pleased to say that that isn't the case. And tonight's presentation will give you a little bit of an overview of some of the contributions of the psychology of religion and spirituality to our understanding of human experience. What we're going to start with today, I'm just going to go through a little bit of the overview, is I'm going to speak very briefly about religion and spirituality. What do we mean by those terms? Many of you here would declare yourselves to be religious or spiritual, or perhaps both, or perhaps neither. So we're going to look a little bit at what do we mean by those terms. I'll then go on to present about the associations between religion and spirituality and mental health. We'll then go on to talk about the upward spiral, the proposed pathways to mental health, and the means by which religion and spirituality contribute to that upward spiral. Then I'm most delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Miller to you, who's going to be presenting from her new book, which is outstanding, called The Awakened Brain, The Neuroscience of Spirituality. So we're really in for a treat this evening. And then she will go on to talk a little bit about the implications of her work for religion and spirituality across the lifespan, and also perhaps a brief conversation about the collaborative for spirituality and education, which I'm sure is dear to the hearts of the education division here at GSEP. So what do we mean by religion and spirituality? You know, there are probably about 100 definitions of both of those terms. And about 10 years ago, Zimbauer and colleagues said their conclusion was these concepts are fuzzy. They are really fuzzy. But we do, over time, we've been able to understand them a little bit better. But nevertheless, I wanted to share just a slide here that goes through some of the ways that people have thought about religion. We have to start with William James, who's really one of the fathers of modern psychology. And he wrote that religion are the feelings, acts, experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they consider the divine. Today, many people, if they heard that quote, they would think, oh, that's spirituality. Because William James doesn't even refer specifically to a church or a congregation or a temple. And you'll see here the other definitions as well. What we will say at this point is there is a rough way of thinking about religion and spirituality, and I would suggest and invite all of you to just think for yourself, how would you define your positioning around religion and spirituality? So religion is an argument, my colleague has written, that it's a search for significance that occurs within the context of established institutions that are designed to facilitate spirituality and may involve beliefs, sacred writings, individual and communal practices, et cetera, et cetera. So it's institutional focused. On the other hand, we see a rise. This is a relatively recent phenomenon in talking about spirituality, which Ken Pargamet would define as a search for the sacred, which may occur either in institutional settings or can be quite individualized. In conclusion, people do not follow religions or religious and spiritual paths in isolation. They undertake their journeys within a larger field of social and cultural forces, including religious group, age, ethnicity, etc. These forces shape the nature of the individual's experience and their spiritual trek over the lifespan. The seeds of spirituality may be found in a person's institutional religious background, no matter their present affiliation, or in religion infused within the cultural surround. In a reciprocal manner, faith communities and religious institutions are animated by individuals' personal spirituality. So the distinctions between religion and spirituality, I think we have to hold them lightly because each influences the other. I'm going to turn now to talk about religion and spirituality and mental health. What do we know? In the past 20 years, over 11,000 published articles have examined the relationship between religion and spirituality and mental health. And I finished reading the last one this morning. There are complex associations between religion and spirituality and mental health. And the preponderance of the research suggests generally modest positive effects, generally. I'm going to briefly go through some of the research, very briefly, in terms of depression, anxiety, and then trauma. Three areas that are really the most widely diagnosed categories within psychology. So in terms of religion and spirituality and depression, we know that it's associated, religious involvement is associated with lower depression and faster remission. However, about half of the reviewed studies found a positive association between religion and spirituality and a better outcome, although 41% demonstrated no significant association and 10% indicated more depression or mixed results. What we see throughout the field are these modest results, these modest findings. And what we also find is that they lean towards positive effects. We always have to look at the individual. Always have to look at the individual. What we do know is that religious coping was inversely related or correlated with depression in more than 1/3 of the studies. But again, what we found is that spiritual struggles, doubts, the lack of meaning exacerbated depression and negatively affected coping. So what of anxiety and religion, spirituality? Once again, it's complex, and the findings are actually quite mixed. What we find if you look at behaviors, religious behaviors, like attending religious services, like performing certain ritualistic prayers, etc., actually they are very poor predictors of anxiety or managing anxiety. However, if we look at a person's relationship with God, however they conceive of the divine, changes. Anxiety is inversely related to the belief of a benevolent, loving God and to a securely perceived relationship with God. Conversely, if there's mistrust in God, it predicts stress and anxiety. And this is a very robust finding, and for those of you who are clinicians, it's very important to assess these dimensions. There was a very interesting experimental study that was done at Harvard about 10 years ago, where they actually trained people to reduce their distrust in God over 2 weeks. And they found it actually decreased stress and worry. So having a belief in God can be helpful. Let's turn to trauma for a moment. This is probably the area that has the most import for whether one has a belief system or not, and the challenges that trauma makes onto one's faith system. And I don't want to throw a psychology. I want to start with Kundera. In The Unbearable Lightness of Being, he writes, "The heaviest of burdens crushes us. We sink beneath it, pins us to the ground. The heavier the burden, the closer our lives come to the earth, the more real, the more truthful they become. Conversely, the absolute absence of burden causes man to be lighter than air, to soar into the heights, take leave of the earth and his earthly being, and become only half real, his movements as free as they are insignificant. What then shall we choose, weight or lightness?" Of course, we don't have the ability to make that choice. Trauma, distress befall us. But Kundera presents a very interesting idea, I think, that's relevant for us, which as part of living means engaging and becoming heavy with the burdens of life. So what about religion and trauma? Trauma can shatter fundamental beliefs, can evoke spiritual struggles, and thereby lead to distress. Potentially traumatic experiences often test a person's religion and spirituality. They can strengthen or weaken someone's religiousness, their beliefs and trust in God, or connections within a faith community. Religious and spiritual involvement generally has been found to be associated with better mental health outcomes following trauma and adversity. And religious meaning making is associated with post-disaster resilience. There's been an abundance of research done in the Veterans Administration and also in the military and in other settings across the world that point out the importance of having a religious faith system, as one copes with uncertainty, copes with harm, copes with disaster. But of course, it isn't universally positive, as I'll note to in a moment. The use of prayer and religious ritual and community support is pivotal as well. Religious distress mediates PTSD symptoms over time. What does that mean? Well, that means that if this trauma has in fact exacerbated or has created religious distress, that's actually going to be predictive of higher levels of PTSD. Quantitative findings predominantly showed positive associations between different aspects of spirituality, that being religious beliefs and in terms of identity. Negative religious coping and spiritual struggles, for example, turmoil with God, are linked to negative after effects such as depression and anxiety. Trauma exposure can negatively impact religion and spirituality and weaken the potentially positive contributions that religious involvement may play in resources. A very interesting finding is that most people actually do not change their religious and spiritual beliefs after trauma exposure. The vast majority do. They hold on to that faith. But significant changes can occur, such as survivors either increasing their religiosity or decreasing. It has an effect. Trauma has an effect. But beyond trauma, life is rarely a straight line, upward journey of flourishing. Some people experience unstable meaning, the unbearable lightness of meaning, leading to threats to well-being, including depression and anxiety. If spiritual struggles and roadblocks to meaning are encountered, negative religious coping may in fact result in negative psychological adjustment. So part of the meta message of this is how religion and spirituality weaves through all human experience. It weaves through all human experience that we need to be understanding of. So what do we mean by the upward spiral? I'm going to describe some of the elements of religion and spirituality that we believe, and there's research to demonstrate this, that will create positive emotion and meaning making that sustains individuals and allows them to flourish. The first is that religious narratives of meaning and transcendence, what Peter Berger called the sacred canopy, we live under a sacred canopy of meaning, helps us to understand and how to relate to the total scheme of things, said Houston Smith, one of the prominent religionists in the United States. So it produces meaning for us that we hold on to, that sustains us, and within communities. The second major area has to do with relationship, because our relationship to the sacred is not just an intellectual activity. It also involves relationship, and for many individuals, it involves a relationship with a God, however that is defined. And that attachment to a God, in fact, builds upon some of the richness of human experience that starts in the earliest moments of life. And what Bolas, and then later I wrote about this, but called the transformational object. That out of early experiences of transformation as a young child, going from wet to dry, going from hungry to satiated, going from distressed to excited, going from over-aroused to calm. These powerful psychological experiences are built within the individual's patterns of attachment and relationship to others, including what will become their relationship with God. There's abundant research to show that these core experiences of attachment will determine the nature of one's relationship and experience of the transcendent. Next, that there are interrelated attributions of positive emotion, virtue, and meaning making that are essential aspects that promote well-being and are associated with mental health. This is another key aspect. If any of you have gone to a religious celebration, I'll frame it that way, and the excitement within the congregation, the feeling that get evoked in religious ritual are exceedingly powerful. And those feelings, as Fredrickson has said, actually will build emotion, will not just build emotion, they will build some of the foundation of strengths for us. I like to quote Hughes. He said that religion acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations. And as Van Kepelen recently has written and researched, religion also will produce transcendent emotions that contribute to an upward spiral of positive emotion and hence resilience and growth. The experiences of positive affect can undo the lingering negative emotions, fuel resiliency, and build personal resources that contribute to resilience and aid in coping and contribute to mental healing. And all this is sustained to a great extent by participation in faith communities. In faith communities in which people come together, reinforce core values, begin to encourage the development of virtue. That's certainly Marty Seligman has written about. So that there are a number of things that religion and spirituality do that actually produce health in us and has that potential. Although we have to always hold the caveat that for some individuals, involvement in religion and spirituality can lead to spiritual struggles. These slides are a little hard to read. This is a schematic. This is how you take the excitement of religion and suck all the life out of it. But essentially what I've written here and what I've schematized is actually all through life experiences as we get, these will produce positive emotions, positive virtue and identity, and all of this will lead eventually to health. This slide's a little bit easier to see, but it's this notion of how positive experiences within the context of religion and spirituality create spirals of positive emotion that actually encourage us and provide a foundation for us to live lives that are full of meaning and purpose. And with that, I wish to turn to my colleague, I deeply respect, Dr. Lisa Miller, who will go actually in a very deep way to talk about spirituality as one of the core components of being a human. Dr. Miller.
Well, thank you. It is such an honor to be here with you this evening. And I will say that Dr. Ed Shafranske has really been a guide and a mentor to me. I remember at the American Psychological Association over 20 years ago, I was so honored to be part of a symposium in which you were speaking. And afterwards, you mentored me, you guided me, you've really been a very generous beacon of light. And so to be here with you now and sharing your community is such a joy, such a joy. And of course, my favorite community is a community that combines, as you do so beautifully at Pepperdine, rigorous academic life with a deep spiritual awareness. So it's a treat for me to get to join you and share this body of work and hear your thoughts and reflections. Dr. Shafranske, shall I go ahead and share screen, or how should we do this?
That would be just right. And thank you for those.
Okay. So I'm here in the corner. Do you see me here? Hello. And I'm going to share with you a body of science that is in the awakened brain. So all of the references of which I speak can be found. You can go on Medline, PsycInfo, Google Scholar, and pull up the specific studies. Because we're moving quickly, I'll share with you an aggregate. So you as teachers and scholars, you as activists and pathbreakers are well aware that we are facing a tremendous challenge right now in the United States, which is that when we look at middle school, when we look at high school, when we look at the university, higher education, we have never seen as elevated rates of addiction, depression, and suicide. The rate of death by suicide rivals the rate of death by auto accident in high school as the #1 killer of youth. So it is not by cancer or COVID that we say Gen Z is facing an epidemic. It is by their own hand. And this would have seemed to me unfathomable even 20, 25 years ago. I'm 57. When I was 17, 40 years ago, I didn't know anyone who had attempted suicide. And yet, as a parent of 3 children who are Gen Z, every one of my children has talked someone down from suicide. Last week, I spoke at the University of Miami, and I said, who here knows someone who's attempted suicide, or once removed, knows someone who's a good friend of someone you know who's attempted suicide? And every student in the lecture hall, probably 200 people, raised their hand. So this is a culture that we have not faced before in the United States. And you could note, how did we get here? I mean, how is it that we developed this really, I'm a very patriotic person. We have challenges in every generation and we fix them, but how did we get here? And it's my view that 40 years ago, in what was intended as a good attempt to be inclusive, we threw all religion out of the public square and actually became radically exclusive. First, we lost the spiritual baby with the bathwater. We became spiritually non-conversant as a society. And second, we lost one of our greatest strengths in this country, which is pluralism, where you tell me about Christmas and I tell you about Hanukkah and he tells me about Diwali or Ramadan. I want to know you in the deepest way, which is in your spiritual and religious heart. So 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a child who grows up and is in your university, is in your K-12, is in your entry-level job or in the military, and all institutions to receive young adults face this same American challenge. And indeed, with the sharp decline in personal spiritual life, family, faith tradition, there has been a statistically directly related sharp increase in the diseases of despair. So as I share this roadmap of science with you now, I invite you as leaders, as educators, as innovators, as scholars, to use this as one more arrow in your quiver, in your vision and leadership, to help address some of the challenges that we face together, because they are indeed fixable. So Dr. Shafranske explored so beautifully, what is the difference between spirituality and religion? Well, as a clinical scientist, as someone who looks at the biological correlates of spiritual life, at the impact of spiritual life onto the rest of our lives, I can share with you what, through the lens of a twin study, are the differences in the origin between spirituality and religion. Dr. Shafranske focused on the profound centrality of transcendence and our awareness of transcendence in this nexus. And that is indeed a very profound point through the lens of clinical science in understanding the origin. A twin study, as you know, can be applied to any human capacity, temperament, IQ, any form of pathology. By way of comparison, our temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. Whether, if you think of the big 5 personality traits, if I'm introverted or extroverted, whether I'm tightly wound or laid back, that if you've ever seen more than one newborn baby, temperament is half innate and half environmentally formed. A twin study can parcel out the degree of commonality between twins raised together, twins raised apart, as a function of genes and environment. IQ is 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life, and quite specifically, the capacity for a transcendent relationship, irrespective of my faith tradition or outside of a faith tradition, the capacity for transcendent relationship is 1/3 innate. It is our birthright. We are hardwired as we are physical and emotional and cognitive beings. Every one of us on earth is born a naturally spiritual being with an innate capacity for a transcendent relationship. Religion, the sacred texts, as Dr. Shafranske pointed out, the ceremonies, the profound tradition and community. Religion is a gift. It is a gift of our parents and grandparents. We may choose a religion and immerse ourselves. Religion is 100% environmentally transmitted. Now, in the United States, it was 70, it's now about 66% of people say, I am spiritual and I am religious. My deep natural spiritual awareness, the capacity for a transcendent relationship, is held in my faith tradition through the prayers, through the sacred understanding of fellowship or community, the Sangha, the Minyan, through the sacred text. Whether or not we are religious, we are all naturally spiritual beings. And as an innate capacity, which is in and through us all, there is a home in the brain. Any human experience has a home. This is the home for our natural seat of transcendent awareness. Now, I do not wish to suggest by any means biological reductionism. I'm not saying, oh, the brain just really makes spirituality. What I'm saying is that there's a neural correlate. And in these broad and pervasive regions in red, we see cortical thickness, greater processing power across regions of perception and reflection, orientation, the lens through which we look deeply into life, a strong spiritual brain in people. Remember, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. People who over 8 years have a lead foot, who say, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. I pray or meditate. People who live into life in a foundationally spiritual walk, inner and outer, over 8 years in this study, showed cortical thickness, strength, like a thick tree across the regions of the spiritual brain. Now, what's particularly interesting is that these regions are not thick, but thin in people with recurrent depression. Dr. Shafranske shared that it is not a simple, straightforward relationship. It's not like there's good spiritual people who don't get depressed, and then those people who just don't build their spirituality, they're terribly depressed. Spirituality and depression have a very rich, intertwined, lifelong relationship. And what we see here in these people who have generously contributed to a 40-year study is that those people with a strong spiritual brain and a strong personal spirituality, at this point in time, if you look back over the past, we see at 16, 26, 38, this cohort. Well, those people who at 26 said, my personal spirituality is highly important to me, I turned to God for guidance. They had realized the nature of their capacity to perceive a transcendent relationship. My personal spirituality is highly important to me. those folks were 2.5 times more likely to have suffered to get there over the past 10 years. 250% more likely to have gone through, whether you call it dark night of the soul or a time of occlusion, whatever your word may be, a developmental depression. There was a struggle through which they may have asked, what is my life really about? I've always felt God's presence and I'm feeling this ache, this hollow. Where is God? What is God? Who is God? This deep spiritual search, fueled and deepened by struggle. 2.5 times more likely. And yet by age 26, somewhere between 16 and 26, this happened. By age 26, those who said, yes, I do turn to God for guidance. They had realized their natural neuro seat of transcendent awareness and lived this, were 75% less likely to have a subsequent depression or recurrence over the next 10 years. Once spiritual awareness had emerged and been integrated, taken in, it became a go-to place. They had cultivated a spiritual response to suffering. And then from 26 to about 32, a sustained spiritual life was associated with a thickening of the regions of what I call the awakened brain, the neural correlates of transcendent awareness. What this means is that every one of us is born a naturally spiritual being, but it is through our own work, whether it's immersion in a faith community, whether it's the inner environment that we cultivate for ourselves, that we realize this capacity, this deep capacity. Whether it is through prayer, meditation, service, right action, whatever our faith tradition may be, there is one awakened brain, one spiritual brain, and we all have it. And it is through our unique paths that this is realized and strengthened. So let's get back to the epidemic. Traditionally, we have located distress and diagnosis at the level of an individual. He meets criteria for recurrent major depression. She has dual diagnosis, addiction and depression. She is at risk for suicide. But when half of Gen Z, half of 18 through 25-year-olds in the United States meet criteria for at least a moderate degree of a disease of despair, addiction, depression, and suicidality, it no longer makes sense to exclusively locate at the level of the individual struggle and pathology, but instead we might look at the pathogenic culture, the tidal wave in the air and water. And let's get back to the overarching trend that there has been, in many respects, a desanctification of the public square. Whether or not I was religious 30 years ago, in the air and water of our culture, there was a de facto sense that, well, I don't know if you happen to believe in God, but our culture overall had a sense of one nation under God. There is a sense of a higher power. There's a sense that morality isn't cherry-picked, but derived from our relationship to ultimate reality. This is not the case. Radical materialism has sunk into the assumptive air and water of much of the public square. And with that, the desanctification of our lives. So I'll share with you, I mentioned I was a parent. When my youngest child was in middle school, she came to me one day with this, the phone. Mommy, look, this girl right here on social media, she's going to kill herself, Mommy. I can't take it anymore. I've been in pain for 2 months. It's not worth it. I'm taking my life. A call on social media. So what might you imagine would have followed in the comments, in the discussion, as this girl screams out that she is going to take her life? You tell your parents, you've got to hold on. You'll come to the other side, get help. What might you imagine? What would you have said? You go, girl. No one can tell you what to do. It is your life. That accounted for about 90% of the comments in the thread. That is the cultural tidal wave of which we speak, radical desanctification of life. And with that, a shift from who we really are to each other. I'll share with you that I have a very dear colleague who recently passed, Dr. Sunya Luthar. Some of you may have known her and her work. Dr. Luthar was devoted to understanding the struggles of children in poverty. And so she looked in many under-resourced inner city areas and found rates of addiction, rates of depression, rates of real struggle, and wanted to understand what are the pathways? How did this happen? And so 1 year, after about 8-10 years of this work, as a control group, she went into a highly resourced community. And by highly resourced community, and she started adding on to these, she looked at well-resourced suburbs outside of coastal cities, outside New York, outside of San Francisco, outside of Los Angeles. And in these highly resourced, excellent high schools, Dr. Luthar ran the same study, and to her surprise found higher rates of addiction, higher rates of depression, and higher rates of suicidality in highly resourced communities as compared within the inner city. And she asked, why? How could this be? What's going on in the air and water of culture? So Dr. Luthar sat down at the lunch table. She went right in at lunchtime and said, hey, can you tell me who's really popular here? And everybody knew, oh, that group of boys, they're very popular. Those girls, very popular. Dr. Luthar returned 2 weeks later, sat at a new lunch table and asked new children, hey, adolescents, can you tell me about that group of boys, that group of girls, to determine the lived behavioral correlates of popularity, social esteem, what counts to be accepted, to belong, to be worthy. So as educators, as people who know so much about our current day culture, I invite you to contemplate what might have been the #1 predictor of popularity in boys and the #1 predictor of popularity in girls. You're welcome to throw it into chat if you might like. Well, it turned out that the #1 predictor, yes, it's in the bandwidth of beauty, and it is indeed in the bandwidth of looks. The #1 predictor of popularity in girls was quite specifically weight. And the #2 predictor of popularity in girls was Mean Girls, like the musical or the film, interpersonal aggression to instantiate rank. That being mean to someone somehow catapulted you up above them. These are beautiful souls on earth, acculturated in the tidal wave. What a harsh way to live. And in boys, the #1 predictor was actually not sports, which is what most people would assume. It was substance use. And the #2 predictor of popularity in boys in highly resourced communities was not intimacy, but conquest, racking up notches on the belt. Again, souls on earth, acculturated in the tidal wave. What is this? What is this? The seeds of not sacred life, not sanctified life, not relational spirituality, but really transactional relationships, because a public square minus the spiritual core is a radically transactional public square. And the kids learn it from very loving, very well-intentioned parents at pickup and drop off. Hey, how'd the math test go? Versus, I'm so excited to see you. You light up my heart. Did you guys win today? You see, a parent at the game, but not at Sunday or Saturday or sacred service. So what do we do about this? Well, there's tremendous grounds for hope, empirically driven and grounded grounds for hope. Because any innate human capacity, and we just saw the red brain, the neuroseat of transcendent awareness, any innate capacity has built in a developmental trajectory. And in this case, it will probably not surprise you to hear that coming of age, middle adolescence to late adolescence, emerging adulthood is indeed a growth spurt. Just as we go home junior year for summer vacation in high school, if you think back to that time, come back as seniors and half the class has grown 4 inches. We grow spiritually. And every tradition has marked this. Bar and bat mitzvah, confirmation, the inipi, the sweat lodge. There's an expansion in physical coming of age, literally puberty and emerging adulthood, with the capacity for spiritual life. Our capacity for a relationship with God or our higher power, whatever our word may be. My word is God, Jesus, Hashem, Allah, the universe, whatever one's word is, the capacity for the transcendent relationship and the very close conduit, which is our capacity to feel that sacred relationship and our love for one another. That capacity surges. It's marked through the lens of science in a longitudinal twin study, through which we see over adolescence into emerging adulthood, a 50% increase in the heritable contribution, which means whether anyone tells us it's coming or not, there's a hunger of the heart for love and connection in the numinous and the felt sense of God or the higher power. And the nagging of the head, what is my purpose? What is my meaning? And I don't mean, will I be a teacher or a lawyer? I mean, ultimate meaning. As I walk the earth, a soul on earth, a child of God, what is my purpose? This process, as we boot up, can feel like a half-empty glass of spirituality, an existential longing. And some young people are quite verbal and they say, I'm seeking my purpose. I want to know what a meaningful life is so I can go live one. And others might be less verbal. I have 3 Gen Zs and some are more verbal than others. It sounds on the less verbal side like everything is so stupid and what is the point? That's an existential comment. This is the most important gift that we can give teens and emerging adults, to walk with them through their process of spiritual individuation, to support their quest, their hardwired body, mind, and soul quest. What is my purpose on earth? And again, capital P in relationship to God, ultimate reality. And what is the nature of ultimate reality? When this process is supported, as again, every tradition on earth has, we see that on the other side of developmental depression is the formation of what I call awakened awareness. In my work with the military, we call it the spiritual core. It is the deep seat of spiritual awareness. And when that is formed, this is published in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. It's referenced in the Awakened Brain. A standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a tendency for a high school student, senior in high school, to say, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does my higher power want me to do? That is not a theory or a theology. That is a lived, dynamic relationship. Is associated with an 80% decreased relative risk of addiction versus someone who says, I don't really know what you're talking about. Maybe something's going on out there. The rich 2/3 embracer, which is cultivated relational spirituality, our relationship to God and the ability to feel God in our love for one another. Relational spirituality, both drawing on the red brain. 60% less likely to have major depression. Remember, every teen will have developmental depression. But the downward spiral to major depression, MDD, is short-circuited because through developmental depression can be built a spiritual response to suffering. And I share in the Awakened Brain, when I was 19 and I had developmental depression, sitting there as a sophomore, wondering if God exists. And so I went to the University Health Center, and I said, you know, I've been thinking about this for about 4 months and it just gets worse and worse. I've always felt close to God. My whole life I felt close to God, and I don't know if God exists. And I've taken world religions and I've taken philosophy, and it was all, an aerial view, nothing experiential. I have no moorings. And the extremely kind, well-intentioned, trained in the manner of the time therapist said, you don't know if God really exists. Was your father there for you? And I said, yes, he was. I had a deeply devoted father. It was not that I was imputing my relationship with my father onto my higher power. It's that I was truly questing to know and feel God's presence on my own terms. Spiritual individuation, the quest. And so I did what I hope most young people do, which is I realized we weren't meeting eye to eye. And I left the dynamic therapist and I went to a CBT therapist. And I told CBT therapist the same story. I said, I sit there at night and if we really take seriously not knowing if God exists, if we really take seriously wondering if it's a meaningless universe, that's a chilly place to be. Right? Many of us are through the other side of that. But if we take that seriously, that's terrifying. And the CBT therapist, again, kind and loving and trained in the way it was delivered in its time, said, are you feeling here, compared to other students, low self-esteem? And I said, no, I have to confess, I feel just fine about myself. I don't know if God exists. And there was nothing in the model of treatment for emerging adulthood. They could write adult adjustment disorder on the insurance form. This was spiritual emergence. College counselors tell me 2/3 of my caseload is really not classic DSM. It's this developmental depression, the knock at the door for spiritual awakening. And it turns out that this is the first of 3 bridges: emerging adulthood, midlife, where we go from asking not what is my meaning, what is my purpose, but how am I living really my ultimate meaning, my sacred purpose? What type of parent, what type of teacher, how am I touching the world? Is it in line with my ultimate spiritual values? And the 3rd bridge, ascending, walking to elderhood. What is my spiritual footprint, my legacy? I don't mean my name on the building. I mean my living legacy. The 3 bridges. And in each time we can track through long-term clinical course studies, a booting up that can feel like a longing and is an opportunity for spiritual awakening to ascend to our next stage. There's nothing in the clinical or social sciences, if we say yes to this formative process, as profoundly protective against the diseases of despair. And speaking now to the first bridge where we started today, in a meta-analysis, a study of studies, 2,000 tragically completed suicides and 5,000 matched controls. There's a 62% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when there's a strong spiritual life, which goes up to 82% when spiritual life is shared in fellowship, shared in the classroom, shared in the family. When both forms of relational spirituality, as in almost any faith community, as in AA, to hand it over, we are built to have handed it over from day one, and to have radical unconditional love for one another. When we use both forms of relational spirituality, we're 82% protected against the epidemic. If I told you, here's a little pill, and it can protect every student in your classroom 82% against the greatest epidemic of their time, who wouldn't pass that out? Who wouldn't give that to our kids? Who wouldn't line up at Walgreens for that? And yet this is our birthright. This is who we are and how we're built. There's nothing at all 4/5 protective against this pandemic that you can buy at the Walgreens. We have published in science things that are 20% protective against suicide, maybe 25. This is 3-4 times the magnitude of anything else we have. Let's go back to the tidal wave. We have disintegrated the spiritual core to the great peril over 40 years of those who were raised by someone in a time where we were silent on spiritual life. How do we bring this back in a way that's inclusive and constitutional? How do we engage developmental depression and struggle, more generally, post-traumatic spiritual growth to support the spiritual core in formation and quest? In the Awakened Brain, I share the references, I share some practices, and I share stories of people who are now contributors like yourselves to our society that went through their own doorway of developmental depression. This is all of ours. And what might be said, Ed, how much time do I have? Is it 1 minute or 5 minutes?
I'd like to give you another hour and a half, but I think.
Is this a wrap?
Yeah, 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay. Quick recap. We are innately spiritual beings, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. There's a neuro-docking station through which we experience a transcendent relationship, who I call God, our higher power, and the presence of that sacred relationship in our love for one another. But 2/3 environmentally formed means that our teachers and coaches, pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, all weigh in to shape the spiritual core. The tidal wave that floods our high schools, ever more so in highly resourced communities, has disintegrated the spiritual core from the whole child. And it is to the peril and the risk of this entire generation as they face the diseases of despair. What about the upside? Dr. Shafranske shared that I come from a tradition of positive psychology. Martin Seligman, 2 decades ago, 2 decades plus, was my mentor. Well, what does the red brain say about the strengths and virtues, grit, commitment, forgiveness, the good stuff? So let me invite you to think, if you will, of a young person you know who's full of commitment. And now someone with grit, now someone with forgiveness. How many people were you thinking of? Many people say one, and this is why. The character strengths and virtues actually do not sprinkle evenly among us. You know, if you threw up chips and they landed, that's not what the character strengths and virtues land. Even they cluster tightly in the very same people. So here we have 5,500 college students in the United States from all different universities, some religious, some non-religious, all sorts of, and in these organically derived categories, through latent class analysis, we see folks in blue, represented here in blue, who are high in everything. They are high in forgiveness and high in gratitude and high in meaning and commitment. Folks in red, who we love just as much, are low in everything. Character for 85% of people is actually a singular trait. Character, like intelligence, G, most of the variance is best understood as a singular trait. There is, of course, you can go use the VIA and find meaningful and true difference, that maybe you're someone with great humor, maybe you're someone with tremendous grit, and that's real. But you're also someone of tremendous character. If you're high in grit, you're probably high in character. If you're high in forgiveness, you're probably high in character. So this capacity, which is probably very strong at Pepperdine, character, is indeed, Marty Seligman was an Aristotelian, a virtue. These are not value neutral. For 85% of college students, there is as much character, broadly put, virtue, as there is on the far left, daily spiritual awareness, walking through life, looking through the red brain, understanding that we walk on sacred ground, being able to perceive into the deeper sacred nature of life. And quite unlike the social media story I told you with the desanctification of life, rather perceive the profound sanctification of life. That capacity, daily spiritual awareness, is highly predictive both cross-sectionally and predictively longitudinally of character. Why? Why would that be? Well, as you know well, here's the hard work of growing up. High school, college, who am I? And who are you? And what's our relationship? And what's really right and wrong? And is there really an absolute right or wrong? Is it driven by absolute truth? Is it driven by hedonics? What is right and wrong? Here's the hard work of growing up. So let's start at the top. Who am I? Well, let's go back to Sina Luther's walk through suburban New York and San Francisco and LA. What did she find? Who am I? In a public square without a spiritual core, who am I? Who am I? I am the one who took 5 APs, and I'm going right now off to college early decision. I took 5 APs. I'm the top 2% of my class. Who am I? I'm the one who made varsity tennis as a sophomore. Actually, I'm the one that was cut as a junior, and I'm not on the team. Actually, I'm the one that hasn't gotten into college at all, and it's May. I am my outward performance, radical transactional relationships. I am my parts and pieces. Number one predictor of popularity is weight, not the nature of the soul. Radical transactional relationships. Well, so say I am top 2% and off I go, early decision, and I'm going to major in engineering, and I show up. In the first week, I'm not in the top 2% anymore. I'm in the middle. I'm in the bottom quarter. That's existentially threatening. Outside, as you probably know, of Palo Alto High School, following a cluster of tragic suicides, the town put up a fence and a full-time security guard. Because if you can delay a high school student for 5 minutes from taking his or her life, they're unlikely to do it following failure. And this doesn't go away because in the very same communities, a fellow will mid-40s, mid-50s, happen to lose money, go in the garage, shut the door. I know these cases, run the engine and take his life over money. Right? Radical transactional. I have no value beyond my dollar value of resources, right? Radical transactional. What's the alternative? Well, if instead we use our deep natural spiritual awareness and feel the sanctification, God's presence towards one another, who am I? Who am I? Well, I might be good at math or not good at math, but that's not who I am. I am a soul on earth. I am a child of God. I am a being of infinite worth. How do I know? Because you look at me that way. It doesn't matter if I come to your office hours and I just got an A or I just got a C. You look at me as a soul on earth. Now, we might have different work at hand, but you look at me as a soul on earth. And so too at pick up and drop off. I'm so excited to see you. Your eyes just sparkle. Not how'd you do on the math test, right? So that is not radical transactional relationships. Those are transformational relationships where we walk with each other and help each other along and see each other through challenges and beautiful moments. It is not keeping up with the Joneses. It is walking with the Joneses, and they walk with us. Well, off to engineering school, I went from the top 2% to the bottom quarter. It is disappointing, but it is not annihilating of who I am. It is just noise on the larger trajectory of my ultimate calling and purpose. Because what is it to be so good at math? That is an endowment through which I might carve my sacred purpose, my contribution, my calling. And on a tough day, again, noise on the trajectory, it still can be disappointing, but it is not existentially annihilating. And therefore, I get up tomorrow and I'm full of grit and determination. Now, if I'm a soul on earth, you're a soul on earth. And our relationship is about interest and encouragement, walking with, transformational. On a tough day, it's about forgiveness. But what it's not about is, oh, you got the 96, I got the 87, you're going to take my place in medical school. Narrow transactional relationships. That is very lonely. Very lonely. So I will share with you, we run awakened awareness groups. Using the awakened brain, we developed awakened awareness, and you are welcome to come train with us for free. This is free and open. We have a big multi-site study across universities because there were so many, Columbia and Barnard, young people who could sit in a big auditorium with 150 students and feel totally alone. Because if you got the 96 and I got the 87 and I now only can compete with you, it's very, very lonely. So can we open up our deep spiritual awareness to draw into a deeper relational connection with one another? I know I'm out of time, so I want to say, I would love to get into a discussion. I would love to collaborate. This is who we are. This is our birthright. And when we can help young people realize their natural spiritual awareness, we are helping to build them into who they really are, who we were meant to be. Yes, we're less likely to be addicted and depressed and suicidal. Yes, we're more likely to have grit and determination and character, all told, because this is how we're really built. We are built to be in a sustained relationship with God, the higher power, the force in us, through us, and around us, and to see that radical love, unconditional love towards one another. We're putting this in K-12 schools in a way that's inclusive and constitutional through our Awakened School Institute. And please join us. You're welcome to join us. It too is free and open. Please join us. We've put this in 4 years. I worked closely with the Pentagon because the same challenges that face students in higher ed face the young men and women in the military, 18 through 25-year-olds. We used the identical roadmap of science in the awakened brain to rework basic training, to make partnerships between behavioral health and the chaplaincy, to allow each leader in his or her band of leadership and across all ranks to use this lens of science to understand the deeper core, the spiritual core of the whole soldier, and the Spiritual Readiness Initiative. And please join us March 28th. I'd be thrilled for Awakened Campus Global, where we look at what you're ahead, right? You have a huge advantage. The foundational spiritual approach to higher education. We opened today with a prayer, and it was nourishing, and it was sacred. And it sanctified our space and our purpose and our conversation. You have so much to bring to this national conversation because it is a crisis. It is a life-saving approach that you have. So please join us. And I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. I imagine your inspirational words have inspired a few to ask some questions. So I think we will start with, we'd like to invite Dr. Kent Rhodes, education faculty member, he's online and is going to share a remark or a question.
Dr. Miller, thank you so much. That was, there's a lot to reflect on there. I took notes as fast as I could. And I really appreciate your invitation to join in some of the things in the future. I look forward to that as well. You know, the notion that the culture, that the tidal wave, and that that what's happened in the air and the water, and that your research shows all of these things, and we're all aware of them, and yet on the other hand, there's hope. But I'm wondering if you could also talk a little bit about maybe the broader context of also air and water, in which we're currently in a situation where the radical transactional nature of things has separated a lot of young people, from millennials down and some older as well, from their faith tradition or the communities from which they might grow spiritually together. And of course, there are theologians that believe that that's probably not a bad thing. Glenda Heath talks about that religion has entered the night of its the dark night of its soul, and that God is in the process of reforming those communities so that people can grow spiritually instead of just religiously. I do have a question buried in there. What are you seeing and what are you noticing about in your all of the work that you're doing about that flight from places of community of faith and how they might be impacting this epidemic that you've talked so wonderfully about tonight?
You raise perhaps the most important question right now of our time, which is how will the spiritual core form in a generation that has not had the rich two-thirds embrace, right? For the first time in my classes, I will find a young person who has never prayed or meditated, whatever that transcendent practice might have been in their grandparents' generation, all around the world. It was not given to them. They have never read any sacred text of any tradition as anything other than a historical document, but as a window into truth or phenomenologically, expansive discovery. No, none of that. So, there is an atrophy, there's a starvation. And I've also noticed a real struggle because for the first time, there's not religious literacy, by which I mean the ability to read and understand in the heart what's being read, not to read it in sort of a two-dimensional storybook way, but to really understand. So in my work with the Pentagon, I worked very closely. There was a collaboration for the Spiritual Readiness Initiative between the chief of chaplains, and a chaplain always goes first by chaplain, and he was also Major General Tom Soljem, and the Army Surgeon General Jingle and Chief of Behavioral Health. And the chief of chaplains said, 25 years ago, after a tough day, like a really tough day in deployment, I'd bring back the squad and I'd say, today was like Daniel. And they'd say, yes, sir, it was. I bring them back today. I said, today was like Daniel. And they're like, who's Daniel? Where's Daniel? No one knows who Daniel is. No one in the whole squad knows who Daniel is. And that's not because they happen to have come from different faith traditions. It's because they didn't have anything. So this is a real crisis. And I have been invited to share this science, both in secular settings and in some religious settings that say, hey, how can we start fanning the fires of authentic spiritual life in our religious school or house of worship? So I think that very sacred spiritual places are receiving young people who don't come prepared and ready for a spiritual experience. So you hit the nail on the head. And I think there's two approaches that are both valuable. The first is the red brains were people with a direct transcendent relationship, right? But over 80% of them were frequent attenders at religious service. So the direct effect was the transcendent relationship went hand in hand with a strong, thick, awakened brain, a spiritual brain. But how did they get there? And that deep personal relationship with God was fostered in the fellowship, the deep practice and regular practice of faith life and religious life. So I am one who says, yes, we are all spiritual beings, and yes, we can get there many ways. But what the data says is that most people with a strong spiritual core have had someone who helped them along somewhere through religion. And I shared with you my talk at a fellow university within the past week, and afterwards a whole group of 18 to 25-year-olds came around and said, my grandma taught me to pray. Yeah. And now when I think of God, it's kind of God and my grandma all rolled up into one. It's the intergenerational passing of the torch. So it's a timely matter, and I think we can renew our faith traditions. We don't need to throw them out. And I actually think it's very dangerous to throw them out. Thousands of years of cultivated spiritual wisdom.
I full agreement. Thank you so much for that response. I'll let someone ask a question.
Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert DeMeo.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for an outstanding presentation, very thought-provoking and moving and really inspirational. As we are all aware, we live in very divisive times. and oftentimes when people talk about religion and spirituality, it's in the context of a very divisive, non-inclusive manner. Uh, when I hold information sessions to recruit students to Pepperdine, sometimes when I mention it's a faith-based institution, I almost always get at least one question that alludes to, will I be welcome here? So can you talk with us a little bit? You've mentioned the term inclusive multiple times, how you build inclusivity while building what you've talked about.
Thank you. I think that in the air and water of that tidal wave is a deep radical materialism. It's only real if you can touch it. It's only real if, if somehow the five senses can perceive it. And I think that is most foundationally what has led to very splintered identities where people think, because I locate myself on the grid, I'm like this, I live here and I'm of this ethnicity and I'm a woman or a man. And pretty soon there's only this many people that I have anything in common with if we have to be identical twins to get along. But I think from a view of relational spirituality, there's one human heart, there's one abundant soul. In the awakened brain, I share that I tell my students, we are a point, we are magnificently, beautifully diverse with different bodysuits and GPS coordinates. And we are part of a wave. We're part of one unit of reality. We are whitecaps on one ocean, Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of inner being. And this deep unit of love of which we are all a part, like rays of the sun, we emanate from one source. This is a felt way of being that is the seat of relationship. So that I want to know you. I want to hear about your story as a point and share it because we're both built of the wave. We're both one children of God, emanations of one sun. The unit of reality has been extricated from society lately because of radical materialism. If it's only real, if it's my bodysuit or my GPS coordinate, but the deep common being of the heart, the spiritual heart, is the unit of reality. And I think we need in our efforts to know and love one another to hold that dialectic. It's very, very important that we're emanations and unique and yet in a deep felt way of being one source. It is what we need, I think, to reinstantiate civil society. That, it's ridiculous that because people have different ideas, they can't be best friends. It's ridiculous that families split over politics. If you're wearing a red t-shirt or a blue t-shirt, I mean, that is radical materialism in a very extreme form. So what you have in a spiritual community, in a religious and spiritual community, is one loving heart. I mean, I can show up at Pepperdine and I can be from anywhere on earth and you see me as a soul on earth and you welcome me as a soul on earth and you see me with love. And you may be very interested in my experience as I come from another part of the world or I look different from you, but you know it and love me through the common human heart. That can go back into society. It used to be that two senators would put their arm around each other and say, me and my buddy here, we disagree. That is not the case, but it can be. And we're very close. I think in their walk, Gen Z is hungry for the unit of reality with their crowdsourcing. And, they date for love and they make businesses with people all over the world. They're living a unit of reality. And they've been handed from the preponderance of academia pretty divisive radical materialist theories of how to live, which is making them unhappy. But I do think you have the antidote where you are. I really do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Amanda Wickrama-Singhay from the Division of Education, who's online, who's going to make a comment or ask a question. Dr. Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your valuable time and expertise, sharing your expertise with us tonight. Your talk was just profound. Thank you again. As you were speaking about finding meaning and purpose and that spiritual core, I kept thinking about the intersection of Western philosophies and Eastern philosophies. And with our students, we teach them to prepare themselves to be the next generation of global leaders, to equip them with the competencies to prepare them for the future of the workforce. And I'm curious because in Aristotle's thinking and his teachings, he talks about the importance of your ethos, understanding your credibility factor. And as the world becomes more integrated and we have this cross-cultural collaboration and understanding both Eastern and Western philosophies, I'm curious to your thoughts on how do we invite our future scholars and practitioners to have spaces and psychological safety to discuss their spirituality in an open dialogue.
Beautiful, Dr. Amanda, thank you. Okay, I have two responses. The first is spiritual multilingualism is tremendously important. It's perhaps the best and important gift we give our students. And I'll share with you, at Columbia, I have a very diverse group of students. They're diverse in every sense of the word, religiously and ethnically and racially and geographically and everything. We sit in small groups and we share from our deepest spiritual heart. And the ground rules are that we speak in the first person of our own spiritual journey. So it's not my attempt to get everyone else in the group to agree with me or that my religion is better in competition. We're speaking to know each other. So we have DEI around race and gender and orientation. Can we have it around spiritual diversity? So we speak in the first person. I want to know you. The second is radical listening. And the third is unconditional love, like a faith community or AA. And it sounds like this. My grandma, she tattooed me and it linked me to my mother and my mother's mother and my mother's mother through all time. And the next student says, yeah, I got that because my grandma, I came home from school and it was my grandma and she'd make me a snack and we sat at the table and we'd pray. And so now God and my grandma, they're all kind of one thing put together. And someone else says, yeah, I got that because my grandma, she's passed and I can tell you that I feel her. I can feel her walk with me. And when my back's against the wall, I can hear her in my mind's eye. And someone else says, yeah, I don't know about my family's own faith tradition, but energy can never be destroyed. So yeah, that's your grandma. The knowing of the heart, which is to say the common seed of transcendent awareness, which is to say passed through the red brain, our deep unitive heart. We know of what each other speak. And can we not just nod with sort of an empty respect, or the Joneses or the Lees or the Rabinowitzes do it that way? No, can we really know of the heart of what each other speak? So that is the goal, spiritual multilingualism. Mazar Banaji found in first graders that by the time a child is 6, he or she thinks that their family's name for the higher power is more real than the name used by the child in the classroom of another faith tradition. And that by the time we're 6, we're more likely to share our peanut butter and jelly sandwich with someone who uses the same name for the higher power. So spiritual multilingualism is perhaps needs to start in nursery school, where we know our own faith tradition and that which our parents have given us, and we can feel in one common heart that which is shared by other people. That's the first part I'd share with you. The second is that Ken Wilber wrote very beautifully about how, as we look around the world, the deep, sacred, transcendent relationship is often heard in what he called the first, second, or third person. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition of which I'm a part, there's a tendency to speak to God and feel and hear a response. And that is indeed how I experience my prayer life. I can hear in my heart, I can hear in my mind's eye an answer from God. It's not a belief, it's a relationship. And I perceive it, body, mind, and soul, through my red brain, through my soul. In the first person, to be one with the unit of reality, the sense of oneness, is often found in many Eastern traditions, the way, the oneness. Right? And the third person, as Wilber talked about it, spirit relationship in and through wind and sun and crow, is often found in indigenous traditions. Whether I happen to conceptualize and hold in the first, second, or third person, the transcendent relationship. Our MRI studies show it is the same neurocircuitry. There is one spiritual brain and we all have it. So the transcendent catch and the catcher's mitt, the direct connection is there for all of us, whether I am Hindu, Jain, Muslim, Catholic, Jewish, whatever my tradition may be, the same neural correlates run. That is our unitive perception. On the Columbia campus, we run awakened brain, we call them awakened awareness groups. And what we found when it comes to inclusivity was that the rate on our campus of LGBTQ students is 20%. But the rate of attendance at awakened awareness groups, which is a spiritual support group, basically, a spiritual awakening group, is 40%. There is such hunger amongst LGBTQ students for the 2/3 embrace, spiritual support, that they're seeking. So anything you do to welcome in people, anything, take the beauty that you have, the power that you have, they're so hungry. There's even twice the desire for you.
Thank you. I learned a great deal from you tonight. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And now I'm pleased to introduce Gabby Slater, who's a doctoral student in the PsyD program in clinical psychology, who's working on her dissertation on religion, spirituality, and religiously accommodative psychotherapy.
Hi, Dr. Miller. Thank you so much for everything you shared with us this evening. I work with predominantly children and adolescents, so much of what you shared are things that I see, especially going into school-based settings and being right there at the school with them, talking to them about their experiences. So much of what you said really, I felt was very impactful and stuff that made a lot of sense to me just from observation of the world that we're in. And I appreciated your story about your own developmental depression that you experienced when you were 19. And when you were talking about going to see different clinicians to get some feedback about what you were imagining or feeling related to the existence of God, you used the word experiential. And I really clung to that word because what is experiential is that which is harder to potentially measure in the paradigm of our research model. And I'm looking at interventions in my dissertation. Dr. Shafranske is my dissertation advisor. And as I look for these very quantitatively supportive, empirically backed interventions, I can say there aren't many of them in the literature as a whole. And part of the reason that I chose to look at this specifically was because I was just curious what was out there that matched this very empirically evidence-based model that is a huge part of our research and how we disseminate interventions. So based on that, which I'm sure you also have seen and know, what are your thoughts about how we might integrate clinically interventions that include religion and spirituality when there are some challenges with how we might be able to turn this idea of religion and spirituality into very empirically supported literature?
Great. It's such a good question. A few thoughts. The first is that while the direct transcendent relationship, our relationship to God, can seem difficult to measure, it turns out we're pretty good. We're pretty good at reporting accurately the extent to which we do feel and know that relationship. And one way that we know we're good at tracking that is that studies where self-report onto our tendency to turn to God and to feel a relationship with God, self-report correlates very tightly with the biological and neural correlates. So that's, I think, one really strong piece of evidence that self-report is actually quite good. There's a self-report measure, which I think is excellent, the Delaney. And in our paper on awakened awareness, the multi-site study is still being finished, but the open trial, and I can send it to Dr. Shafranske and he can share it with you. We use this measure and it bears fruit. It always bears fruit. It bears fruit in MRI studies. So the Delaney is a beautiful measure. And what's so interesting is that it measures both a theistic relationship with God and also a sense that God is in and through all creation, what they call eco-spirituality. Both have the same neural correlates. Both are measured by the Delaney. They're separate subscales. So that's in that paper and it's referenced. So I will send that to Dr. Shafranske, and that reference will be there for you. I think you had another question. Help me answer all your questions.
I know we're low on time, so I don't want to, take away from anybody else who has to ask a question. But no, I think that what I asked was kind of a big question. It's how do we get around this idea of what's evidence-based and empirically supported when we're trying to draw in other pieces of human experience in terms of how we put out interventions. Because of course, so many of our interventions that can be widely used for many people have to sort of fall inside this empirically supported paradigm. So there seems to be this kind of gap between how our research model looks and what we're able to really study.
So I have the view that if you, as a deeply spiritually inspired clinician, which you clearly are, truly just follow your truth and follow the truth, it will have a footprint empirically on changes in meaning and spiritual awareness and depression and cope. It'll all follow. But in my own path, I would say I'd always start with the deep truth that you know in your heart, and it will pan out as you rigorously show that to be the case outwardly in a clinical trial or anything else. I tell my students to start with intuition or a mystical experience or something in their prayer life, and then apply the scientific method in its exposition and inquiry. But the question comes often from a spiritual origin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're running a bit short on time, but we would like to give the opportunity if anyone here in the audience has a question or a comment they'd like to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Dr. Deborah Bradley. I am an alumni of Pepperdine, but I'm also the behavioral health director at a very large agency. And I find the data and the presentation very, very interesting, because one of the challenges that we face, which goes back to Dr. Mayer's questions about the stigma around integrating religion and faith-based interventions in clinical practice. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to promote the spiritual piece within the organization in which I work, especially among the clinicians that we're training. So my question to you is, how do we, I have some ideas, but I want to hear yours. How do we even begin the discussion of religious interventions? Yes, we can put forth the empirical evidence, right? And I think that is really helpful. I think that is what I'm going to use as well, in terms of it is not just an experience, like you're saying, how do you measure the experience of faith? But there's evidence to show that it is a very powerful intervention, right? So how do we begin the discussion in a secular world? Because when we leave the university walls and it's said, and we get out in the world, and it's real, there is a stigma around putting in religion as part of clinical interventions, right? Why? So how would you discuss that in a secular setting, so that it is not a turn off, right? It doesn't come off as being intolerant or no, I want dismissive. So how do you incorporate that? Because it's so valuable.
Thank you. And I'd be very happy to have a fuller, more extensive conversation if you want to connect another time as well. And thank you for your leadership in doing exactly what you're doing. So I'll share with you a few thoughts. Let me back up a bit. I've found in this work, science-based work on the integration of spirituality into mental health and thriving, that the full arc needs to be addressed. So treatment, prevention, wellness, formation, the whole bit. We need to get upstream before these young people end up in the therapist chair. And when they're in the therapist chair, we need to support the spiritual core. So in my work with the Pentagon, there was the decision made by the Army to put into every treatment team a universally trained chaplain. The roadmap of science, as I shared it with you here, and it's in the Awakened Brain, it's there for you, was interpreted by the Pentagon to, we need spiritual support in the treatment team. And their approach was to bring a universally trained chaplain to work alongside classically trained behavioral health. I call that model the layer cake, where you have a chaplain and you have a classically trained behavioral health specialist working together like a layer cake. Another model, which is the model that we teach at the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Columbia, that I started, is more like a swirl cake. We teach people spiritually grounded approaches to psychotherapy, that the frame of treatment need not be radical materialism, but that it is quite possible this person is in a living relationship with God that is opening up new doors. So we don't need a priori to predict and have an ironclad treatment plan. We can be on a quest together, listening through them to where their emerging guidance is coming. We are loved, held, and guided. So the swirl cake is one approach. The layer cake is one approach. And in my own point of view, the choice is the clients. And I would say the breakdown's about 50-50 in our country. Right? And they're all welcome to layer cakes and swirl cakes. I think that any system can hold both, and that we can be client-centered, as you're suggesting. I agree with you. The science kicks open doors. I was able to do the work in the Pentagon because we led with science. We went to 30 posts in 4 years through COVID and always started with the science. I'm working with the Department of Health and Human Services, Reverend Dr. Q English, on community-based partnerships between the clergy and lay leaders and community, whether it's a school or a treatment center or a substance abuse center, partnerships working together. It looks a little bit more like a layer cake, but it's sort of a hybrid in the middle. So those are examples, but I'd be delighted and to really dig in and speak more at length. There's a large national network of hospitals that's tangling with this now. And I'm happy to share experiences and learn from you about some things you've seen.
One more question, I think, if you have time, Dr.
Yes, yeah. I live for this. This is it.
Hi, nice to meet
Hi.
you. Thank you so much for your talk. I am Gen Z, obviously. I think I look like Gen Z, but what you said was so spot on. Just with around everything, especially I forgot your term, but radical transactional relationships. And this has been something I've just been thinking about for a while. I'm a current master's student at Pepperdine for the Marriage, Family, and Therapy program. But my question was, how do you ethically counsel on spiritual awakening, especially in terms of religion? Because as counselors, we're helping our clients, but I fear that, especially when counseling on this, it's so dangerous to it. There's a high possibility of you really influencing the client on like how they choose to go about their spiritual life, especially in terms of religion. So how do you ethically do that?
Beautiful. So there was something so beautifully put by, I shared with you how the Pentagon is working on universally trained chaplains. So although every chaplain comes from an endorser, and I know you're talking about mental health, whether I am, again, Hindu or Catholic or Christian or Jewish or Muslim, the chaplain, to be universally trained, sits and listens for the whisper of God in that person, or for the telos of spirit or consciousness, whatever your word is, in and through that person. So it's a deep form of listening and perceiving and walking with them on their quest. I think it's tremendously important. I think it's the heart of mental health, full across the spectrum, from treatment to formation. It is the most important work we can do. We're human. We don't get everything perfect, but it's so important we can't afford not to do it. And in fact, I think that the silencing of spirituality in mental health is disintegration, and disintegration's unhealth. I share in the Awakened Brain that I think much of mental health that is silent on spirituality is actually causing iatrogenic harm. Iatrogenic harm is when you go to the hospital and you have a broken arm and you leave worse with TB because you got sick in the hospital. And I think when we silence a spiritual response to suffering in our most painful, I'll share a story. I share this in more depth in the Awakened Brain. When I was starting out as a new therapist in the late 90s, I was on an inpatient unit where there was tremendous pain and suffering in New York. And the patients started coming up to me, and I'll give you a very illustrative story, knocking on the door. Dr. Miller, could you come here? And come here meant leave the office where we do therapy. No, here more. Walk down the hall. In the middle of the unit, it smells like cleanser and there's blaring lights. No, back here. No, come here, Dr. Miller. Into the kitchen, to the back, to the pantry. And there with the pots and pans over our head. Dr. Miller, will you pray with me? That patient felt that in order to find shared fellowship, to pray together, 82% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when spiritual life is shared, that we had to leave the mental health establishment and go into the pots and pans closet. That's a disintegration of the spiritual core. There was something in the air and water of mental health treatment, certainly at that point, and I think in some places it's still somewhat there, that absolutely was causing iatrogenic harm, because that patient was yearning to cultivate a spiritual response to her suffering. And one story after the next of people seeking that. And when we do offer them the opportunity to nourish in their way, in their terms, their spiritual awareness, there were radical shifts in awakening and reillumination. So I'm so grateful that you're doing this. When we stick with the patient, have a patient-centered or a student-centered stance towards their own whisper of God, their own telos through them, then we walk with them on the journey. And I think that is the most important work we can possibly do. That is handing it over alongside, all that you've learned in the ultimate moment is, I think, to be with them as they awaken to their own relationship to God or the higher power.
Before the ending, I want to honor those people that are online that I may be really dying to ask you one final question. So I don't know if there's anyone online who would like to. No, I think we are filled up with the wisdom that you have shared with us. And are there closing remarks, or may I?
Would you please join me in showing appreciation for both Dr. Shafranske and